In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the process of state building in the 17th century, paying particular attention to France. What is the process of state building? Well, uh, it's best to look at the goals that places like England and France have in terms of state building. Um, the most basic aspect of state building is that these individuals, whether it's the King of France or others, they want to strengthen the power of the state. They want to make the state stronger. Uh, and they propose to do this through increasing the efficiency of governance. Now, this may mean parliamentary reforms, this may mean legal reforms, this may mean a whole series of other aspects that are changed in this process, but all of them are aimed at the goal of strengthening the power of the state. Now, the solutions to this, there are two general solutions to the issue of state building in the 17th century. The one we're going to be focusing on is referred to as absolutism, and this is what takes place in France. And as you can tell by the name, absolutism really has to do with having an absolute single ruler who is in charge of everything, the entire apparatus of the state of governance. And so that would be the courts, that would be in charge of finance, that would be in charge of the military. Everything is run through and by the absolutist ruler. And that's what we're going to look at most today. There is another alternative to that, and that alternative comes about in England, and that's referred to as constitutionalism. In England, the ultimate theory that came out of a series of struggles that you've read about in your textbook, including the English Civil War, was that an absolutist ruler should not be the one in charge, and in fact, there should be a document, a constitution, that limits the power of the monarch. This process is referred to, as you can see there, as the process of constitutionalism. And that is, there will be a document, in this case the English Bill of Rights, that in this case the king and leading members of state, many of them nobles in England, will agree to. And what that does is it agrees to certain rights and responsibilities that the king has in relationship to those that are governed. So for example, it might limit the power to draw up troops, it might limit the power to raise taxes, it might impose certain mandatory meetings on Parliament that the king must call Parliament at various times. The idea then is a constitution will then provide for certain checks and balances in this system. Now you can read more about that in your assigned reading, the English Bill of Rights. You can also read about it in your textbook. Here what we're going to focus on is absolutism in France. In order to understand French absolutism, you need to understand the context in which Louis XIV does try to consolidate his power. And the main problem that he faced was factionalism. This means that there was a series of factions that were vying for power in France at the time that threatened the king being able to maintain control all by himself. And some examples you see are listed here. One example is Parlement. Now notice that the phrase is not spelled with an IA in the middle there like Parliament. Parlement was the legal aspect of French governance. They were the ones that controlled the law and the judges. Now, in this case, what had happened is because the main legislative body of France, known as the Estates General, had not met in a long time, they had been pushing for and petitioning to be in charge of taxation. That was not traditionally what they were in charge of, but they wanted to be in charge of taxes. Taxes and revenue, obviously, are very important for the running of a state. Louis wanted to ultimately, and he and his advisors wanted to maintain control over that themselves and not even allow the Estates General to have it. But here was another group, the Parlement, that wanted to be in charge of that, and that could chip away power of the king. Many members of Parliament, as well as others, were part of the nobility. Traditionally speaking, the nobility had lands and often their own mini armed forces, often with castles. They posed a threat to state building. They posed a threat to the power of a king because they could quite literally oppose him with force of arms. And many of them did not like to be controlled or taken over by the king in any way, shape, or form. They did not want to lose their autonomy. In addition, there was also the problem of regionalism. France is a very large country, and many people did not identify as French and necessarily identify the king as their direct ruler. Many people's identity was more about their local region than anything else. And so this created a problem for creating a sense of national identity. for the French. And that would create a problem for a king being in charge of a group of people who were more concerned with their regional identity than they were with a national identity. Many of these factors came together in a rebellion that took place, or a series of rebellions that took place when Louis XIV was very young. These rebellions are known as the Fronde, which you see there as a term. Textbook talks about these in a little more detail. But basically what the Fronde was a series of rebellions against the government, against the power of the king, that created quite a problem for Louis. In fact, it actually affected him personally, because many of these individuals at one point actually broke into the royal palace in Paris and even into his own bedroom, terrifying him as a young boy. So he remembered all of these things as he was growing up, and he made it his personal vow that he would never let himself or any other French king be intimidated by the Fronde or the nobles ever again. And so most of these reforms are actually aimed at never allowing that position or a situation to ever come up. Louis's solution was absolutism. That is, he wanted to completely limit the power of these individuals, or if not curtail it altogether, and have all power vested in the king himself. And he proposed to do this through a variety of ways. And one of this was the notion of having one king. So there's going to be three ways that he does this: one king, one religion, one government. Now, the way he goes about this for himself actually is best summed up in the phrase that he uses, l'état c'est moi, which quite literally means I am the state. Well, here it means the state is me, but I am the state. That means, and that is how to best understand absolutism in a nutshell. If you had to describe it with one phrase, it would be that: I am the state. Everything revolves around Louis, or at least he'll make everything revolve around him. One of the core justifications that he uses for being such a strong and centralized rule is this notion of divine right of kings. This is something that's not unique to France and had been in place for a long time, but what it does is it combines religion and politics, particularly the notion in Europe that the Christian God in this place had placed Louis as king into his position. That the idea was is that God chooses whichever kings are going to be in charge. What that means is that not only does God sanction this individual as a king, but that anybody who goes against the notion of Louis being king, that goes against the king in any way, shape, or form, is actually going against God. So this was a perfect way for Louis to combine religion and politics in order to strengthen his power, because you can now call down eternal damnation upon anybody who opposes your rule. And that would work very well for nobles all the way down to peasants. Another way that Louis ensures this absolutist rule is that he completely changes how governance functions. And what he does is he promotes two things. One, he promotes a very formalized court ritual. This is something that's going to take place in the court of Louis XIV. He's also going to promote the arts as well as an expression of French grandeur, which you can see in this image in the corner of the slide here, where it's a portrait of Louis amongst all of these various aspects of art, such as music, ballet, and other things that were meant to show the greatness of France, but also the patronage that Louis had for these things. But I want to focus on court ritual. This is one of the most important aspects of absolutism. In the case of Louis, one of the most important things was his creation of the palace at Versailles. Versailles had been a small hunting lodge prior to this, but what Louis did is he moved essentially the French capital from Paris to Versailles, way out in the countryside, and then created this elaborate palace where all of the government functionaries, all the nobles and everyone had to go there in order to be by Louis, in order to essentially be part of the government. So if they wanted to be a bureaucrat, they had to go to Versailles various times during the year, and often for quite a long period of time. What this did is it removed them from the areas in which they usually had power, their regions, forced them to pack up, go to Versailles, and what Louis really tried to do was to, rather than have them compete against him, that is, vying for power against the king, he actually preferred them to compete against one another for royal favors. So again, this process takes time, but eventually what Louis did is he would bring all of these nobles to Versailles, use the grandeur of the palace to quite simply seduce them into accepting his rule, and they would get all sorts of perks and favors and special rooms and board and food, and of course course, direct favors from the king in terms of positions, and all of these things meant that they would squabble and struggle with one another as opposed to uniting against Louis himself. One of the things that you'll also notice about Louis is that he's often referred to as the Sun King. In part, this comes from a role that he often played in ballet, and particularly one where he played Apollo, the god of the sun. But he really did promote this as this sort of radiant figure who was oversaw and ruled over everything. And you can see this most especially in the creation of the Palace of Versailles. So let's look at a couple of those images here. Now what you see here is an aerial view of the Palace of Versailles, and actually you're only seeing a small portion of it. You'll be able to see a little bit more in a schematic in a moment here. But this is where the king brought all the nobles out to essentially participate in this courtly life. And as you can see, I mean, it's multi-leveled. There are many different wings to it. This was a massive undertaking that includes all of the lands behind it that you see there that are forested. This was an incredibly ornate palace. Here is one small little tiny courtyard that's not even a main courtyard, and you can see the amount of architecture and gold and design and all of these elements that go into making this an incredibly illustrious palace that the nobles would want to actually be there and participate in this courtly life. I mean, there's all sorts of perks for being there. You also have part of the grounds here as well. I mean, you have these very well manicured gardens that people could wander around in, not necessarily in their cruddy little castles or estates that they had. So you had this wonderful place for them to congregate, and all of it was at the sort of favor of the king himself. So the more favors you had, perhaps the better position or the better room that you had. When you look at some of these things, like this, the famous Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, you can see the amount of wealth that the king is pouring into this, which also demonstrates his power as well. I mean, if you notice that you have the gold inlay all up and down the ceiling there, you also have all of the paintings, these murals that are on the ceiling. You have statues and gold encrusted candelabra at every opening there. You have these massive windows, all the chandeliers as well. I mean, this whole thing screams opulence to it, and everyone who was involved in it felt a sense of the grandeur themselves, that they got to be a part of this. Here is another picture of another part of the Hall of Mirrors, and you can just see how clean, resplendent, sparkling, and brilliant this place is. And it was an effective lure on the part of Louis XIV to bring these nobles to Versailles, where they often had to stay for months at a time. And again, they would want to get the perks and the favors associated with this much more than they would to unite against each other and fight against the king. Here what you see is an aerial view of the grounds of Versailles, and if you look very carefully, when I showed you the first image of Versailles, was only that little section that you see in the center there. But then you have all of these wings on all of these different sides. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to figure out which of those little tiny wings out there was actually one of the entrances that I showed you. So you have this massive spread of land that is all controlled by the king, and it in itself, architecturally, reflects the absolutist nature of Louis. Particularly if you pay attention to how well designed it is and how well laid out it is in a grid pattern. It's very organized. Everything has its place. That's exactly how absolutism works. The king is at the center of the political world. Versailles is that center of the political world, and everything else sort of orbits around him. And you can see that laid out in this sort of masterful plan of the entire grounds of Versailles, the order and organization that goes into it, a reflection of the absolute control that Louis himself wishes to have over his nobles and every other aspect of his government.